Nobody in that courtroom expected the word duty to become the thing that broke everything open. It had been used dozens of times before that moment in the proceeding. Used carefully, used precisely, used in the way that legal language uses words that carry enormous weight by distributing that weight across enough sentences that no single one of them collapses under it. Then J.D. Vance used it differently. He used it like a door he had been waiting to open and had finally found the right moment to walk through. And when he walked through it, Karoline Leavitt was standing on the other side without the documentation she needed to hold her position. The proceeding had reached the point that complex legal arguments always reach eventually. The point where the general framework both sides had been constructing gives way to specifics, to names, to dates, to the particular decisions made by particular people at particular moments that cannot be absorbed into a broader narrative without first being accounted for individually. Leavitt had arrived at that proceeding with a position that the people on her side of the argument considered solid. She had built her case around a definition of duty that was narrow enough to be defensible and documented well enough that challenging it required more than a competing interpretation. It required evidence. Specific evidence that her understanding of the obligation in question was not the understanding that the record actually supported. She believed she had accounted for every version of that challenge. She had not accounted for Vance. He had been quiet for most of the early portion of the proceeding, listening in the way that people listen when they are not waiting for a gap in the conversation, but waiting for a specific word, a specific claim, the precise moment when the other side commits fully enough to a position that dismantling it produces maximum effect. Leavitt gave him that moment without realizing she was giving it to him. She was constructing the central pillar of her argument, the part that everything else depended on. She was describing the nature of the duty in question, defining its scope, establishing the boundaries of what it required and what it did not require, and why those boundaries meant that what had happened fell within acceptable limits rather than outside them. She was 3 sentences from finishing that construction when Vance spoke. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform the interruption. He simply said her name and then said one sentence that identified exactly where her definition of duty diverged from the definition that appeared in the document he was holding. Leavitt stopped. She looked at him. She looked at the document. She asked which document he was referencing. He told her. He named it. He named the section. He named the page number. And then he read the relevant language aloud so that everyone in the room heard both versions simultaneously, her version and the version in the record. The gap between them was not subtle. The document defined the duty in question in terms that were broader than anything Leavitt had been working with. Broader in a specific way that meant the boundaries she had been drawing around the obligation did not exist in the record the way she had been presenting them. The room registered this before Leavitt responded, because the people in that proceeding who understood the case well enough to follow what had just happened could see immediately what it meant for the argument she had been building. If the duty was defined the way the document defined it, then the boundaries she had established were not boundaries at all. They were positions, and positions can be challenged in ways that boundaries cannot. Leavitt's response came quickly. She was not someone who needed time to find her footing. She had been in enough adversarial situations to know how to absorb a challenge and continue moving. She acknowledged the document. She did not dispute its authenticity. What she disputed was its applicability. She argued that the section Vance had read from applied to a different set of circumstances than the ones currently before the court, that the duty defined in that language was contextual. That context determined scope, and that the context here was specific enough that the broader definition did not govern what had actually happened. It was a strong counter, strong enough that the room shifted slightly back toward equilibrium, strong enough that a less prepared opponent might have needed to recalibrate before responding. Vance did not recalibrate. He had anticipated the context argument. He had anticipated it because it was the only argument available once the document was in the room. and he had prepared for it in the specific way that turns an anticipated argument into a trap. He asked Leavitt a question, a single question about the context she was describing. He asked her to identify when the contextual limitation she was referencing had been formally established, not assumed, not implied. Formally established. In writing, in a document that could be pointed to in the current record. Leavitt began her answer. She referenced a series of decisions and communications that she argued collectively established the contextual framework she was describing. She was specific, she was detailed, she named dates and named offices and named the general nature of the communications she was relying on. And while she was naming them, Vance was writing, not taking notes in the casual sense, writing in the focused way of someone cross-referencing what they are hearing against something they already know. When she finished, he looked up. He picked up the second document, the one he had not used yet, the one that had been sitting in front of him since the beginning of the proceeding. He described what it was. He named the office it came from. He named the date it was produced, and then he described what it contained in terms precise enough that everyone in the room understood what was coming before he read a single word from it. What the second document contained was a record of the same period Leavitt had just described. The same offices, the same decisions, the same general time frame. But what it showed about that period was different from what Leavitt had just told the court, not different in interpretation, different in documented fact. The communications she had described as establishing the contextual limitation did not appear in the record the way she had described them. What appeared instead was a sequence that showed the duty in question had been understood by the people exercising it in exactly the broader terms the first document defined. Not the narrower terms Leavitt had been arguing, the broader ones, which meant that the people responsible for carrying out the duty had understood it the way Vance was defining it, and had made decisions based on that understanding, which made the question of whether those decisions met the standard of the duty considerably more complicated than Leavitt's argument had suggested. Leavitt looked at the second document. She asked to see it. Vance handed it across. She read the relevant section. The room watched her read it. The silence during that reading had a specific quality. The quality of a room where everyone is waiting for a response and nobody is certain what the response can possibly be. She set the document down, she looked at Vance, and then she did something that experienced observers of legal proceedings recognize as significant. She did not immediately respond to the document. She responded to the proceeding. She addressed the court directly. She argued that the documents being introduced needed to be considered in their totality. That individual sections read in isolation created impressions that the full record did not support. That duty in the legal sense had to be understood as a whole rather than assembled from fragments selected to support a predetermined conclusion. It was a skilled pivot, a genuine one. The argument she was making was not without merit in the abstract. Context does matter. Totality does matter. The problem was that making that argument required her to implicitly acknowledge that the documents Vance had introduced were accurate, that they said what he said they said, that the duty had in fact been defined and understood in the broader terms he was arguing, because you cannot argue for totality without accepting the parts. And accepting the parts meant accepting that her original definition of duty was narrower than what the record showed the people exercising it had actually believed it to be. Vance waited until she had finished the pivot. He let it land fully. He let the court hear it completely. And then he said the thing that the entire preceding exchange had been constructed to make possible. He said that the totality argument she was now making was precisely the argument that supported his position rather than hers. That if the duty was to be understood in its totality, then the totality included every document he had introduced, every date, every decision, every communication that showed the obligation being interpreted in the broader terms. And that totality told a story about what the duty required that was very different from the story she had walked into that room to tell. The room went still, not the brief stillness of a dramatic moment that passes quickly. the sustained stillness of a room where everyone present understands that something has just been settled that is going to be very difficult to unsettle. Leavitt looked at the documents on the table in front of her. She looked at the documents in front of Vance. She looked at the court. What she said next was careful and measured and professionally composed in the way that only someone with genuine composure can manage in a moment like that one. But it was not an answer to what Vance had said.